question already. This is the first time.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to the library. I'm Bruce Farrar. I'm the Branch Services Administrator. And on behalf of the Metropolitan Government, Mayor Bill Purcell, the members of the Metro Council, and the Public Library, Donna Nicely, our Director, and the members of the Metropolitan Library Board, we want to welcome you to the library. We're delighted that you could come out on this bracing spring day and participate in what will, I'm sure, be a stimulating discussion. I mean, it's hard to get better than that. We also are absolutely delighted to have our co-sponsor here, Vanderbilt University, who not only supplies the intellectual nourishment, but also has supplied the lunch. So you can't be, I mean, where else can you go where there will be free food and free sex? That's better than Vegas. Now, of course, they are collecting some money, but that is just for the food, okay? I don't want any little innuendos or misquotes in the Nashville scene next week, okay? Let's be careful of that. And I believe how public officials can get themselves into hot water by tackling this political issue is what we'll be discussing. So before I get myself in any deeper, I would like to introduce to you the Associate Vice Chancellor for Public Affairs, Beth Fortune, of Vanderbilt University. now that I've besmirched the name of your institution.
No problem. Thanks very much, Bruce. One of my colleagues last week said that the topic today, sex, morality, and law, was just calling my name and that I needed to come and make the introduction. And apparently I see that I am not alone, so I would like to add a very big and warm Vanderbilt welcome to you. The Thinking Out of the Lunchbox program has been one of Vanderbilt's most successful partnerships ever, and we are grateful to the Downtown Library, to Bruce, to Donna Nicely for being such great partners, for allowing us to gather here in this world-class institution to hear world-class thinkers like we will today, and we have over the past 5 years. You know, one of the great things about working at a university, and Vanderbilt in particular, is that every day we get to engage in the kind of intellectual discussions and debates that will be ongoing for the next hour. And so we are delighted that we can bring these kinds of discussions to downtown. I want to thank you for attending today. I know you will go away fed physically and mentally, and we hope that you'll return time and time again. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce David Wood, who is the creator and the leader of the Lunchbox series. He's a professor of philosophy at Vanderbilt, and he's one of our great thinkers, one of our most engaging faculty members. And I know for those of you who are Lunchbox regulars, and I assume that there are a few out there, you know that David asks provocative questions, he leads interesting discussions, and he runs the trains on time. So please help me welcome Professor David Wood.
Well, thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Beth. And thank you for coming. I'm glad we didn't put any other buzzwords in the title. We wouldn't have fitted you all in. It's really my pleasure to welcome Dean Ed Rubin to this series of talks. I'll change. That's better. Ed joined Vanderbilt as our new Dean of the Law School last July, and as the first John Wade Kent Severard Professor of Law. He had been the Theodore K. Warner Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School before he came here, where he taught administrative law, commercial law, law and technology, and various issues surrounding human rights and punishment. A graduate of Princeton and then Yale Law School, Dean Rubin has set himself the task, I think, of reinventing legal education at Vanderbilt, in particular giving academic substance to the students' final year. And in the short time he's been here, he has, I can tell you, impressed everyone he's met. He was attracted to Vanderbilt, I think, because of our culture of innovation, which comes from the chancellor and the provost right down to all the faculty. And in particular, I think the commitment that we now have to interdisciplinary education, where a really vibrant law school is a key player. And I think it's fair to say that what attracted Vanderbilt to him is his extraordinary combination of scholarly creativity and passion for educating students. In addition to all this, Dean Rubin has a worldwide reach. He's served as consultant to the Asia Foundation Project on licensing law for China, for the Russian Privatization Center, and for the United Nations Development Program. But let me say a few words about the scholarship side of things. His books include Judicial Policy Making in the Modern State, How the Courts Reformed America's Prisons, the two-volume Beyond Camelot, Rethinking Politics and Law for the Modern State, and a forthcoming book, Federalism, A Theoretical Inquiry. And I understand there's yet another book that's at least more than a twinkle in his eye on morality of self-fulfillment. And he's written all sorts of major law review articles on government, crime prevention, and democracy. I think his general line of thought, and of course as soon as you say a thing like this you end up getting it wrong, but is that we can't successfully improve or critique modern governance unless we set aside traditional concepts such as power, democracy, legitimacy, rights, and property, which were largely developed in the Middle Ages. So we've got to need a conceptual revolution, in a sense, to deal with problems of the modern state. Modern government, for Professor Rubin, is an essentially administrative structure, best understood through engineering and management science models. Now, as I understand it, he's not approving of this or disapproving of this. He's just telling us we need to get real about the way things are if we want to change things for the better. And my guess is that he would argue that we need to get over many of our reactive moral attitudes to create a more just society. Now, the obvious question that his the next but one book is going to deal with is whether there's any room for anymore for moral and political argument about fundamental ends, or whether the best we can do is just to adjust the machine that we're part of. And I think today's talk on sex, morality, and the law, which begins by, as I understand it, by meditating on the central but puzzling role of moral issues in the last election, will take us to the heart of these questions. Please welcome Dean Ed Rubin.
Thank you, David, and I want to thank the Metro government and the library for providing me with this venue, and thank all of you for coming. Just a brief word. I did arrive in Nashville and at Vanderbilt only a short time ago. I had spent my entire life in the Northeast or on the West Coast. One of my friends, when I said I was coming to Nashville, said, "Oh, so you're moving to the United States?" And there was something to that. But I've been, it was terra incognita to me. Philadelphia was the furthest south and furthest inland I'd ever lived. I came because of how extraordinary Vanderbilt is, how just exceptionally well, not only well run, but how imaginatively and innovatively run it is by Chancellor Gordon Gee and the Provost Nick Zeppos. And since I've come, I've just been delighted not only with Vanderbilt, but with this whole community. And I think it's been a wonderful experience for me and my family, and a wonderful chance for me to have an opportunity to work with the law faculty, as David was suggesting, to really rethink the way we're educating lawyers in the 21st century, because that's a very important task. Education in general is, and lawyers have a big effect, for good or ill, on our society. And so this has been a terrific opportunity for me. We at Vanderbilt Law School are at the forefront of legal education in the United States, and I do believe that over the next decade we will set the pace for it because of the way the university is run, and because of the way that the faculty works together. Now, having said that, let me go on to talk to you today. My talk is based on a law review article I wrote, which, as David was suggesting, is a preliminary version of a book I'm working on. The book actually talks about the relationship between concepts of morality or structures of morality and structures of government. But today, I simply want to talk about structures of morality and their evolution. And to start off, as David was suggesting, by noting that the exit polls after the last presidential election revealed that the single biggest issue that people based their votes on was something called moral values. This was at a time, of course, where terrorism was on everybody's mind, and the war in Iraq, and health care and Social Security, and all these other issues, but moral values came up number one. Now, moral values could mean a lot of different things, but we all know what it meant. And specifically it meant, I think, four issues, which was gay marriage, abortion, birth control, and sex education in school. And what's common to all of those, of course, is sex. And I don't mean sex in some fancy academic discussion of gender and concepts of yin and yang. I mean screwing, sex. I know I shouldn't use that word at the library, but think what I might have said. Now, okay, so sex has been around for a long time, a couple of billion years, according to most biologists. Why? But it has not been an issue in American politics until very recently. If you think back about Washington and Jefferson and Lincoln and Wilson, nothing comes to mind in terms of any position they were taking on the subject of sex. But all of a sudden, in our current political atmosphere, it's become a major subject of controversy, and the question is why. And so that's what I want to think through with you in the next few minutes. Now, I think the subject of why we have the political affiliations we do and why we have the combinations of issues that we do is a complicated matter that hasn't been addressed by too many political scientists. Let me give you one puzzle. Why is it that if we know that someone is a proponent of abortion, is pro-abortion, we can be almost certain that they're against the war in Iraq? Why is it that we know that if someone is opposed to gay marriage, we can be pretty sure that they're in favor of just desserts punishment, that is to say, harsher criminal punishment, as opposed to rehabilitation? I mean, there's no logical relationship between those two sets of positions that I gave you, and yet I think we all know, as a matter of common experience, that the correlation there is very strong. The person who I think has written most thoughtfully and most insightfully about this is a cognitive theorist named George Lakoff. And what Lakoff suggests is that we have conceptual structures that are neither ideological nor logical, but rather conceptual or emotive in nature. His suggestion is that when we think about the government, when we think about our society, we analogize it naturally to a family. And our ideas about what's good or bad at the political level are conditioned by our attitude toward child upbringing. And he identifies the modern political scene by identifying two clusters of views, one of which he calls strict father morality and the other of which he calls nurturant parent morality. A strict father mentality is a mentality that focuses on rules, that focuses on discipline, that focuses on a sense that the world is a threatening place and that you need to be strict with your children, to set rules. Let me read his words. He says that you need to teach them right from wrong by setting strict rules for their behavior and enforcing those rules through punishment. He contrasts this with what he calls a nurturant parent morality. A nurturant parent morality is one where the view is that you have to develop the child's creativity, that you have to be kind and nurturing to them, that it's better to give them rewards than punishment. Again, in Lakoff's words, that you want them to become responsible, self-disciplined, and self-reliant through being cared for and respected and through caring for others. And what he says is that if you take the modern political scene, what you can see is these same attitudes, that people who we associate with conservatism have a strict father morality, and the people we associate with progressive or liberalism, not in the philosophic sense, but in the modern political sense, have a nurturant parent morality. And he says, for example, you might think that people who are conservative are opposed to government expenditures. But he says, when you look at it, that's not right. Because, of course, conservatives are in favor of increasing expenditures in prisons. They're in favor, typically, of the war in Iraq. Those are massive government expenditure programs. The question is, what do they view as worth spending money on? Liberals decry those expenditures, and yet at the same time want more expenditures for things like social programs. And what he says is that logical connections are not the explanation, but rather these conceptual structures are. And I think that is actually a very insightful way of looking at modern politics. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't quite help us with this issue, because one of the things that Lakoff doesn't deal with, and is almost precluded in a certain sense from the question of what kind of parent are you, is sexual identity and sexual role, which seems to be at the forefront of the debate about moral values. So what I'd like to do is explore the conceptual structures that we have that govern our views on that issue, and then trace them through our political system. And what I'd like to do is contrast two different notions of morality. And morality, I'm going to talk about morality mainly in relation to sex, but you'll see these are general moral structures. It's natural, of course, that sex plays a major role. It's hard to imagine anything that we'd want to call a morality that wouldn't address that topic. The traditional morality that we inherit from our history, and let's just start, let's say, at the year 1000 going forward, which can be roughly described as Western culture, is what I'd like to call a morality of higher purposes. And this is based on what Max Weber called the world rejection aspect of Christian religion. That is to say, the extent to which Christian religion, like certain other religions, represented a rejection of the aspects, the earthly or corporeal aspects of the world, and an effort to reach for a higher spiritual plane. And the way this played out in Western history was that those parts of life that were that simply were more connected with emotions or lust or desire and couldn't be avoided became sublimated through the notion of higher purposes. That is to say that what your desires, to the extent that you were going to fill them, were supposed to serve a higher purpose, and specifically a religious purpose. And obviously this relates very directly to the issue of sex, namely that sex is necessary for continuation of the species, to put it in modern terms, or Christian communities, to put it in medieval terms, but that sex was regarded as something to serve that higher purpose. And you can come up with, of course, a number of scriptural accounts for why continuation of the species was a religious value in and of itself, but doing that is the higher purpose, and that's what sex was supposed to be. So the whole notion was marriage was that sex was to occur through marriage, and marriage was sacramentalized because it wasn't to be enjoyed for its own sake, rather that it was to serve a higher purpose, which was continuation of the species and continuation of the Christian community. And this, in turn, related to a general notion of all the things that are the facts of everyday life being directed toward this higher purpose. And indeed, that's what the purpose of the state was supposed to be. It was supposed to create the conditions by which individuals could achieve salvation, that is to say, a higher purpose. And this becomes a comprehensive morality. It becomes a way of ordering society and thinking about what's right and wrong. That is to say, that what's right, what's righteous behavior, involves behavior that serves a higher purpose, serves the purpose of salvation or of getting or following the commands of God. Now, what happens in the 18th to 19th century is a dramatic secularization of culture. And with this, I want to argue, comes in a new morality. And that morality is something that I'd like to call a morality of self-fulfillment. And the morality of self-fulfillment does not deny human desire and human lust as being valued in itself and directed toward a higher purpose. Rather, it says that all our desires are part of a goal of maximizing our own potential, of making ourselves the best people possible and having the best possible experience of life. In other words, a morality of self-fulfillment. And that modern attitudes toward sexuality, or attitudes, evolving attitudes in the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, are allied with this notion, with the notion that sex isn't something that serves a higher purpose, but rather serves the individual's purpose of being one path to self-fulfillment, and so having a fulfilling sex life becomes one part of having a fulfilling life in general. And the pivotal figure here is Sigmund Freud. Now, Sigmund Freud's been a subject of a lot of controversy. He was just on the cover of Newsweek, and there have been a lot of questions as to whether or not what he said, what his theories are scientifically demonstrable. There are many psychologists who regard them as essentially nonsense these days. But there is no denying Freud's cultural impact. He is, in my view, the single most important figure of the most influential figure of the 20th century. And of course, what Freud does is sort of clarify. I mean, he didn't cause it, of course, but he clarifies this whole cultural evolution, this whole development, by placing the notion of human beings and the notion of our internal life in health rather than in religious terms. And what he's saying essentially is that sex is a human desire that can, if not satisfied in a fulfilling manner, lead to ill health, lead to neurosis, lead to psychosis, and that the solution is to become conscious, aware of your desires and how you can fulfill them in a way that integrates with your entire life and have a fulfilling life. And so it becomes a mental health problem, and it becomes not a matter of being a source of guilt, but being a source of of health concern as to what your attitude is toward this. And I think we can see Freud as emblematic of a larger trend of thinking about human beings in this manner. And what I want to suggest is simply what we have here is a conflict between two different moralities. Now, if you ask the question, well, which is right or which is better, you can immediately see the problem. The terms right and better are terms that are derived from morality. So what we have here is a cultural change that puts into question the very ground on which we stand. That is to say, the very terms that we use to evaluate and make judgments about things. And that is an event of the modern world. And what I'd suggest is it's a disconcerting event. It's one that causes a certain amount of stress in society in general and of people in particular, as this major sea change in the way we think is played out over the course of several centuries. And what I would suggest is that our political disagreements and our political controversies are in part driven by and reflections of precisely this underlying change in morality. So if we go back to the components of the concept of moral values that people identified as being a concern in the last election, let's start with gay marriage. Well, you can see from a morality of higher purposes that gay marriage would be something that people would oppose, because the purpose of sex is procreation, and gay marriage is not a relationship that will lead to procreation. It declares itself by its nature as being one that doesn't have that purpose, and indeed is for the purpose the purpose of the two people involved having a sexual relationship. Abortion is, again, people who believe in a morality of higher purposes would be opposed to abortion, because the purpose of having sex is supposed to be to have children. And so you're supposed to have sex in a marital relationship, and you're supposed to have children as a result of that. And that's why I think many of people who are opposed to abortion, although they say it's because the fetus is a human being, will make an exception for victims of rape, because the victim of rape was not engaged in sex ignoring the higher purposes of it. She had no desire to engage in sex. She wasn't. She was opposed to it, and so it's not. She did no wrong in the sense of a morality of higher purposes by getting pregnant, as opposed to the person who voluntarily gets pregnant. With birth control, the big controversy has been, of course, there was originally a controversy over birth control itself, and that involved exactly the same issue, that birth control is a way of having sex without serving the higher purpose of having children, and that's something that has been largely resolved already. I don't mean in any objective sense, but just in the sense that it's no longer subject to controversy. But modes of birth control, and particularly Plan B, which is the so-called morning after pill, continues to be a subject of controversy for what I would suggest is essentially the same reason. That is to say, it's a way of having sex without detaching sex from procreation. And finally, you have sex education in school. And the interesting thing about that is that the conservative position has been that abstinence is the only thing that should be taught in school, and their claim is, abstinence is the only mode of or not having, of avoiding the effects of pregnancy that's absolutely 100% effective. And of course, when you think about it for a second, of course, that's not true, because abstinence is a result. The method is willpower. And as we all know, that's not 100% effective. What's involved there, of course, is the same attitude that teenagers, particularly who everyone agrees shouldn't be having children yet, should not be having sex. Now contrast that with the liberal or progressive positions, which is that in favor of gay marriage, because for gay people, marriage is a mode of self-fulfillment. It's a mode of having a fulfilling sexual life as part of a generally fulfilled existence. That abortion is acceptable because, again, it's an unfortunate consequence of having a fulfilled sexual life and should not lead to an unfulfilling life for either the woman who would wind up having an unwanted child or the child who would be born into a situation where it wasn't wanted and therefore would be unlikely to have a fulfilling life. The same, of course, can be said of Plan B, and the same, of course, could be said for the progressive attitude toward sex education in high school, which is that we should teach the whole range of contraceptive methods so that teenagers can certainly avoid, this would be the sort of more limited position, certainly avoid the unfulfilling result of either having to have an abortion or having to have a child when they're a teenager, or maybe so that they can have fulfilling sex lives, because teenagers, by the time they're in high school, are sexually mature and very often sexually active. Just in concluding, it's not surprising that if you look at the country as a whole, what you would see is that the urban parts of the country and the parts of the country that are open to a higher level of interchange of ideas would be the ones that would adopt a new morality, whereas the rural and areas of the country that are more isolated or more insulated would stick to an older morality. You can see this in the transition from paganism to Christianity in 1,500 years ago, and I think you see this now. And if you look at the political map of the country, what you find is that the political party that has aligned itself with the morality of higher purposes indeed is strong in rural areas, and the political party, Democrats who allied themselves with the morality of self-fulfillment, is strong in urban areas. Now, if you look at the map of the United States state by state in the last couple of elections, what you'll see is blue along the coasts and red in the center, roughly speaking, which reflects that, but at a very gross level. Because, of course, you have lots of rural areas in blue states like California or New York State, and you have, lots of Republican areas in blue states. I don't know if like New York or California, and you have plenty of Democratic votes coming from states that went Republican like Texas or Georgia. If you then go down to the next level, though, and look at the county-by-county map, what you'll see is that general pattern of the United States reiterated in virtually every single state. That is to say, every single state has a very large area of red and these small clusters of blue. So if you look at a blue state, like California, what you'll see is just concentrations of blue in the metropolitan areas and large areas of red in the rural areas. It's just that in California, it's a very heavily urbanized state, so on balance, it went Democratic. Whereas if you look at a state like Georgia, you'll see clusters of blue in city of Atlanta and a couple of other urban areas, large areas of red. It's just that the urban-rural balance is different. The state went Republican. Now, that's a very broad generalization, but what seems to me is that there's we can explain a lot about the current political complexion of the country in terms of this underlying change and this underlying evolution in basic moral structures and the way the political parties have affiliated themselves with it. So with that, I'll stop and I'll look forward to your questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, as you know what happens now, I get to ask Professor Rubin a few questions, and then we will ask you for your questions. So I'd like to just start out just asking a question about self-fulfillment, because you're making this sort of contrast between, let's say, traditional morality, which was designed to serve a higher purpose, and I guess I'm thinking at the very opposite extreme, you've got something called self-fulfillment. And I guess I'm thinking that a lot of people would now think of self-fulfillment as at least potentially very narcissistic, narrow, self-centered, etc. And that it's actually that morality, even if you think of it as an emerging morality, it may have emerged and had its head chopped off a little bit, because it's also seen to have limitations. And I suppose I'm thinking there may be another way of putting that, or maybe a third term here, which would be something like morality of creative engagement with others. What I mean by that is that you could imagine self-fulfillment as another name for the selfish pursuit of one's own single pleasure, which is incompatible in some ways with, especially with creative, sexual and other human relationships. So I'm wondering whether you really want this word self-fulfillment.
I do. Let me say, of course, I didn't try to play these out in great deals, but a morality is a generalized standard of behavior. And what a morality of self-fulfillment means is that we're committed to each person's self-fulfillment, not only to our own, but the self-fulfillment of others. And so, for example, instead of condemning people for homosexuality, we would regard it, according to morality of self-fulfillment, as immoral to criticize people for the way that they find fulfillment through sex, for example. Or to give another example that actually has a strong imprint on popular culture, is the notion of, and this goes back to Lakoff in a certain sense, the notion of what you're supposed to be doing when you're bringing up children. According to a morality of higher purpose, it's to train them to be moral beings and to have a fixed morality, namely this morality of higher purposes, whereas the morality of self-fulfillment suggests that upbringing, the parental relationship, is one of teaching the child how to fulfill himself or herself and fulfilling yourself as a parent. And think about how many movies you've seen that involve a parent getting back in touch with their children. This is almost a raw nerve in modern culture. I mean, it comes up in action movies, in Arnold Schwarzenegger movies, and things like that, because it's something that represents a whole rethinking of what it means to be a parent. So what I would say is it is a morality because it's a universal standard that we not only want for ourselves, but we apply to our relationships with others and to what we want other people to have for themselves.
Okay, so it's not just about myself, but it's universalizable to
right.
selves.
It's a morality, not
right.
not simply a philosophical egoism. Right?
Okay. Okay. The next question I had was something I've talked about with friends, and it has to do with just how far you can go with Lakoff, or whether you can perhaps go further with Lakoff than you've gone. And it would go something like this. I think you're saying that you can go up to a point with Lakoff, and some of these connections that he charts is just extraordinary. I mean, this model, the claim that if you have these two models, the strict father and the nurturing parent, you can just show how all these political options just divide so neatly. But what you seem to, you correct me if I'm wrong, I think you at a certain point say, well, we can go so far with that, but when it comes to sexual morality, we need another bifurcation, this between traditional and emerging, or morality of self-fulfillment. And what I'm wondering is whether you can't explain quite a lot of the preferences about sexual morality in Lakoff's terms directly, because the strict father may also be a sign of, or a mark of patriarchy. And if you understand patriarchy in its broader sense, it might well involve the need to control the behavior of women. And abortion, a woman's right to choose, means, I mean, one of the things it means is that it's not her husband's right to choose, or it's not the father's right to choose. So that what we've got here is an extension of the strict father principle, rather than an emerging morality principle. And so that, I mean, I'm just wondering whether this is a more economical model for you.
It wouldn't quite work with homosexuality or with sex education, we might want to teach abstinence to girls and not to boys if we were really strict
Well,
patriarchs. But
We kind of do that, actually.
I don't think that's what is being proposed by people who are talking about what we should do with sex education in high school. But it really, my concern with not using Lakoff as the whole explanatory mechanism has less to do with whether or not you can make his structure reach that, as trying to get at something he doesn't get at. One of the problems with his approach, I think it's very interesting, explains a lot. It's not historical. That is to say, it doesn't naturally link to social evolution. And it seems to me that really strong explanations for what's going on in contemporary politics, for example, should tie into a historical account of the way society is developing. And what I've tried to do is take a pretty broad historical sweep in this article and in the book I'm writing, because I want to see if I can explain things in terms of the way society is evolving. And the thing about moral structures as opposed to images of parenting is that it does tie into an account of the development of concepts across a sweep of Western history. So that's really what I was trying to get at.
Okay. Well, I've got, I guess, one more question that's a bit broader, and it doesn't directly relate to the content of your talk, but it relates to the question of morality. And it goes something like this, because I did a little bit of background reading on stuff you've been writing. And in particular, this double volume thing on on judicial policy making and on rethinking politics. And you say something there which I found incredibly challenging and worrying, which is that so many of the concepts that we use in thinking about politics today, like, and I'm quoting here, power, democracy, legitimacy, rights, and property, are outmoded concepts, and that they derive from a whole different period. This is back to sort of historical analysis, perhaps the Middle Ages. And that we need to stop talking about democracy and stop talking about rights and property. And this is pretty much from a summary of your book, okay, which I guess you wrote.
I guess I did.
And that what we need to be doing, and I mean, there's a serious point to this, that if you understand modern government for better or for worse, in terms of its administrative organization, what we need to do is to not get blinkered by these old-fashioned ideas, but because if we really want to improve the way these systems operate, we have to think more like an efficient administrator. And I'm wondering where moral concepts fit into this whole picture of yours, because it's sort of central to your talk today that we sort of open ourselves up to a more plastic sexual. I think when I ever hear the expression plastic sexuality, I think of
Giddens,
well, Giddens, but I also think of very strange
right,
things.
yeah.
But a more open, let's say.
Yeah.
But where does that leave sort of moral critique of the state that we live in? I mean, is that all old-fashioned, middle-age too? Like
Well, I don't. Yeah,
old
I
Europe?
mean, it would take me too long to summarize a 400-page book, whatever it was, right now. But let me say that what I was first of all suggesting was not that we're going to stop using these terms. Obviously, we're not going to, but that they were not useful ways for scholars and policy analysts that were trying to think about the kind of government we have and the way to improve it, because they carry too much conceptual baggage with them. But what I was wanting to suggest was that the way we think about the morality of modern government, as well as the efficiency of modern government, will be improved by coming up with different categories that represent more accurate descriptions of the kind of government we actually possess. Let me give just one very quick example related to the subject of democracy. Democracy has clinging to it the Aristotelian notion of direct democracy. And we don't, and have never had in Western society, direct democracies with a few insignificant exceptions. What we have is representative government. And thinking about the mechanisms of representative government and thinking through the modern way in that works, not only is more efficient, but may have a normative improvement as well. For example, we think a lot about elections. We don't think very much about lobbying administrative agencies. And yet, if we think about the relationship between a modern government and its citizens, it's much as likely to be played out at the level of an interaction between a government agency and citizens as it is through electoral politics. And the morality involved, the morality of how the government treats its citizens and how we get our voices heard to that government, may turn just as much on how we interact with agencies as how we vote in elections. And so not so much getting rid of the term democracy, but suspending it and say what is actually going on in our government may well help us normatively as well as descriptively understand how we carry out our goals of having government respond to us and making our voices heard to government.
I mean, that's really interesting, because a lot of people would complain about contemporary democracy, that being able to vote every few years is not democracy. And you're saying, well, that's not all there is. There's a whole lot, there are many other avenues here of having your voice heard. I think that's really fascinating.
And the one that we yearn for, we're never going to have, which is Aristotle's all the citizens assemble in the assembly, in the arena, and vote directly on government policy. That's something that you simply cannot make work in a modern state.
Well, the closest version we're going to get to that now is to actually ask our audience for questions in a direct, participatory manner. And then what we do is we just collect these questions until we got enough, or until we're overflowing, and then we let our speaker answer them all at once. Okay. Let's start off with this lady here.
What role does the rise of capitalism have in this development of a morality of self-fulfillment?
Yes, lady here.
I was fascinated by your talk, but I'm curious. It seems the morality of higher purpose, since that, as you were describing it, from the Republicans into Democrats, is that why Republicans can have a party plan and go with it, while the Democrats are all over can't agree on anything? And the next question is there anything to be done about that? Thank you.
Okay, let's have this gentleman up here, and then we should move.
This may be the first cousin to her question. Back in 93-94, Newt Gingrich did an artful series of focus groups where he worked on identifying moral value buzzwords that at least 51% of the population of voters would respond to. Use that along with the Contract for America or Contract on America, depending on which side you're coming. Use that to help shift the voting population majorities to the point that until he was able to get at least a 51% majority in county after county after county. Senator Barack Obama has stated that really Americans are not so much blue and red in terms of politics, but really we are more a blend of purple, if you will. And I guess maybe this will be a chapter in your upcoming book, but since 1996, we've seen the Republican majority seize the buzzword high ground, and using those simplistic tools appeal to the art of conceptual politics. And I'll just be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yes, the gentleman back there.
In the morality of personal achievement, is there room for a concept that something is evil, or is this something that is values-free?
Yes. Gentleman over there.
I was just wondering, when we look at the architects of the Constitution writing in the path for pursuit of happiness, if the angle they were taking was self-fulfillment morality or the other kind, but yet, of course, during that time when they wrote that, it wasn't very, say, self-fulfilling for the slave population. But I was just wondering if what's happening is by adding more people in society, more types, that if it's becoming more of a problem of you're not like me.
Thank you. Is it a lady over here?
This one?
Yep.
I did recently read that more people voted for American Idol than voted in the last presidential election. And I just wondered, do those people not have any issues, or what's going on there?
Well, I realize that when times get crowded, that people, that homosexuality is up. I realize that abortion is a very controversial issue. All these are inevitably going to be in the public. But I wonder if it is your opinion that this has been accentuated by Clinton's so public self-fulfillment.
How are we doing? Any more questions? We try and overload the speaker so that... Yes, there's a gentleman here at the front.
You can probably hear me, can't you? Isn't morality really something for other people we ourselves feel a little bit exempt from, and an election device sometimes?
Shall we give you a chance to
Sure.
answer some of these questions?
All right, let me start off with the general questions about morality, then talk a little bit about the more general questions about society, then talk about contemporary politics, since that seems to be the grouping of the questions. So starting with the last one, is morality for other people and not for ourselves? It's always, of course, easier to impose moral demands on other people and make excuses for oneself. But if you look at anything that can be called a morality, it has to be a universal rule for human behavior. I mean, the only meta-ethical principle that doesn't fit into that, I suppose, is egoism, and no one has really tried very seriously to construct what you would want to call a morality based on that. So when we look at moralities, we're looking at universal sets of rules. Of course, it may be a good question how demanding those rules are and how likely it is that we're going to get individual compliance. And that might be one meta principle that you might want to use if you're trying to compare the goodness of morality, something that's in general a very hard thing to do, because as I suggested, morality gives you its own terminology. The question of evil, evil has a particular meaning and a particular inherited meaning in the traditional morality, the Christian morality of higher purposes as I've identified it. I would say that there's a sense of contemporary morality has a sense of wrong, and whether or not people would feel comfortable associating the wrongs associated, for example, the wrong of not bringing up your child in a way that enables the child to develop its full potential, but rather imposing some kind of rules on it, and this, of course, does connect up to Lakoff, would be regarded as a wrong. Would it be regarded as an evil? Well, I think the problem is that the term evil brings up reverberations of the prior morality. So something can be immoral, but whether or not you'd want to call it evil might depend on whether or not your concept of evil is essentially the same as wrong, or whether it has more of a theological implication to it. Now, in terms of our culture, absolutely, I think that you can see the rise of capitalism very strongly connected with this. One thing about capitalism is it allows for each person to pursue their own sense of how they're going to maximize their income, which is a part, of course, of fulfilling oneself, of having a good material life, which becomes more important, and it also favors opportunity over protection. And so in that sense, I think it's very closely allied to it. And if you think of the contrast between a modern market economy and a guild, where there was this sense that competition was supposed to be constrained and limited by this, again, a sense of a higher or communal purpose. I think there's a connection between those. I could say a lot more, because I think what's happening, I would want to link the Industrial Revolution, I would want to link social science, I would want to link the development of the state. These things do move in large, coordinated ways, precisely because culture is connected, and the ways we think in one area are naturally going to affect the ways we think in another. I think the American Constitution is a reflection of this process of transformation of morality. And the fact that it was written in secular terms, the fact that it's the Declaration of Independence speaks about the pursuit of happiness, the preamble to the Constitution speaks about creating a kind of a secular society. I think all of those are part of it. There's no question that slavery was part of an earlier notion. The first people who opposed the first global condemnation of slavery came only in the late 17th century with the Quakers. The first major thinker who actually comes out against slavery isn't until 1748, when Montesquieu publishes The Spirit of the Laws. So it is a development that's joined up, I think, with these other notions, and getting away from hierarchy and getting away from everyone's equal in the afterlife, to the sense that everyone should have a fulfilling life in the here and now. And of course, what you see in our Constitution is the same kind of shearing, the same kind of grinding of conceptual gears we have now. It's just on a different issue. We resolved slavery, but it certainly wasn't resolved in the late 18th century. And what you have in the Constitution is a conflict. On the one hand, the general words of the Constitution talk about all people being equal, and the specific clauses authorize slavery because there was a sense of stress connected with a social evolution from one to the other, and we actually had to fight a war in this country to resolve that one. Now, hopefully we're not going to have to fight a war to resolve our current political disagreements, but I would say that in terms of the sort of micro developments at the present time, I think there's been a rising sense of dissatisfaction on the part of people who still feel committed to what I've identified as a morality of higher purposes. If you think about it, the post-war era has been an era of unbelievably rapid social change. I would say that the role of women has changed more in the last 40 years, in most of our lifetimes, than it has in the history of the world up till that time. I would say the same thing is true about the role, the status, not the world, but Western society, about homosexuality. And so there's been just enormously rapid social change, and I think that naturally produces a reaction on the part of people who aren't comfortable with this. And I think the Republican Party has been very good at tapping into that. And yes, I think they have an advantage. A morality that's been in existence for, at a minimum, of 900 years is going to produce a lot more certainty than an inchoate one that's in the process of evolving all around us and whose ultimate shape we still can't define. And David's first question to me was a challenge to me. Can you define this more crisply? And my answer was, well, maybe sort of, but I'm not exactly sure, because it is something that's that's evolving, and the old comment that you have to the nature of life is that you have to build your boat at sea. And that's that's the situation that we find ourselves with respect to evolving morality. So absolutely, and that does give an advantage to the defenders of a certain rhetorical advantage to the the defenders of the existing order. And as to what Clinton contributed to that, absolutely. Boy, I mean, if there was anyone who typified a morality, this sort of modern morality of self-fulfillment, that it's not just it was just not the Monica Lewinsky scandal. It's the whole sort of aura that he projects, and he, although he was a very popular politician, served also as a very effective recruiting tool to people who were who were uncomfortable with that. As to why, finally, as to why people don't vote, I think to some extent it's part of the same sense of cultural confusion. And for some people who are who can identify themselves with one or the others, the political parties make sense. To people who are themselves divided about this, who aren't all that upset about homosexuality or gay marriage or abortion, and yet at the same time feel a continuing commitment that others don't to traditional structures, they don't know exactly what to believe, and the parties aren't speaking to them in the same way that they're speaking to people who stand on one or other, more clearly on one or other side of this transition. There are lots of other reasons that have nothing to do with anything I'm saying about why people don't vote, but at least that may be one way that this discussion could add a little insight to that.
Well, we have actually, for the very first time in this whole series of talks, moved ourselves to another level, because we've got actually an email question, which has never happened before. And I thought we might just use this as the basis of a straw poll, rather than asking you to give a final verdict on it. And the question is this: what is the status in our society of there being universal moral truth? Do we, as a society, believe it, or do we reject it? In other words, are there universal moral standards? And I thought I'd just like to find out what we think. So, people who think there are universal moral standards quite straight across the board, nothing to do with history, but just true across the board. So you can put your hand up just to let, so we, that there really are these things. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay. Yeah, they keep to 1, 2, 3. Okay, roughly okay. And people who think that maybe there should be, but there aren't. There aren't universal moral standards. You might like them, but there aren't any. The question is, are there universal moral... Okay, the question is, are there universal moral standards that are true across time and space and culture and so on? But my sense from this audience is that they are completely split. That we've got both your kinds of morality here. We've got the emergent ones, and then we've got the traditional ones. Well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank our speaker for today, too.
That satisfied your...
Oh, yeah, perfect. Thank you so much.
I'm Jane Stone. My husband's Sam.